So right now we let the user type all this stuff in and we're logging it to the console, which is a good like incremental step. And I guess that's one thing I should like explain. I'm trying to model good software development behaviors that I really, really, really want you all to adopt when we start the summative lab next week and all of next semester. So you'll notice I'm not doing this entire create entry feature in one big swoop and then trying to debug it because that would be a nightmare. I'm doing very small steps, right? Like at first, I just had us go to the page and I had a very simple set of elements for us to fill out. We then just replaced the box, the text box with like radio buttons. Okay, but that was it. We're just logging everything in createentry.js. We're just logging the data. We're not even talking to the server yet. Now we're ready for that. Now we'll actually talk to the server. Okay, but we're doing this step by step incrementally because it makes it so much easier to debug. And I'm committing after each incremental step so that if I really mess something up, I can go back to where I know things were working, right? So please do this all the time, especially next week when we do the summative lab, because it will save you huge amounts of time. But now I think we're ready for the next step. The next step is let's take all this data that the user entered, and instead of logging it to the console, let's actually send it to the web server, okay? Because that will actually be useful. Eventually, we can get it in a database. But again, small steps. We're not going to do the database step yet. But we are going to get the data to the server now. So let's take a look at that. So what we're going to do is instead of logging this just to the console, we're going to actually build up a JavaScript object with all the data in it, and we're going to send that data to the web server using a post request. So far, we've just done HTTP GET requests to get HTML from the web server. Now we're going to do an HTTP post request to send data, specifically JSON data, to the web server. So this is what it looks like. So I'm going to delete the console.log thing, and we're going to make a JavaScript object called entry, and it's going to contain date. I'm going to change this a little bit. Habit of mind, content. So I'm purposefully kind of showing you some options here when we use an object literal in JavaScript. We are used to specifying properties and values like this, where we have the property name, a colon, and then the value of that property. So the habit property has a string value, which is the habit of mind they selected in the radio buttons. But notice that for date and content, there is no colon. And when there is no colon, what this means is it's a shortcut notation to say, create a property called date with a value of this date variable here. And create a property called content with the value of this content variable here. So it's just a shortcut notation for creating JavaScript objects. You never need to do it, but you're certainly going to see it in JavaScript code. So I want you to just be aware of it. That's all. All right. So now we are going to send this data to the web server, which is super cool. So we're going to create a local variable called response. That looks pretty good. Great. Let me double check though. So, and talk through it. So we're going to create a variable called response. If we do a fetch command, we need to put an await in front of it. So we're going to wait for the promise to be resolved, because fetch is an asynchronous operation. It returns a promise immediately, and then that promise isn't resolved until we get the response from the web server. So we're going to wait for that response. So I'll put in a wait in front of the fetch. We're going to the create entry endpoint like we did before, but now we're specifying in our second argument to the fetch command, which is this object here. Our HTTP method is post, not get. And we're specifying some header information. we're specifying that the header for this post command, the content type is application/JSON. This tells the server, hey, the data you're getting is JSON formatted. So you need to interpret it in a JSON way. So that's critical to include this, or else it's not going to work. And then, as we talked about before, when we do a post command, the body of that post request contains our JSON. And here's where like JSON and JavaScript play so nice together. We can say JSON.stringify, and it will turn this the JavaScript object referenced by entry into JSON for us, which is super nice. Okay, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. So it's really easy to convert our JavaScript objects to and from JSON. So this does the whole fetch command, and we have an error. Let's see what the error is. Oh, we can't use the keyword await outside of an async function. That is true. So what that means is the function we're currently defining needs to be an asynchronous function. So we have to go up here to where we're defining the function with the arrow function. And before those parentheses, we have to put the keyword async. So we are defining an asynchronous function, which it has to be because it has the await keyword. Yes. No, it just lets like my understanding is it just lets the JavaScript engine. So I guess yes, because it lets the JavaScript engine know that this is an asynchronous function that actually could return a promise, and there might be an await inside, so it might sleep as it's waiting that. So I assume the JavaScript engine has to do something different to accommodate that, which is why the keyword's required. Not 100% sure on that, but that's how I imagine it must work. All right, so let's check the response. We know that the response the promise has been resolved because we have the await keyword here. So we can say if response, I usually do this instead, if response.ok, which means like, hey, it worked. If we get an okay response, we'll do window.location. We'll go back to the home page. If we don't get an okay response, I'll be honest, we're not going to do a lot of error handling. So we're just going to log it and stay on this page, and then we'll have to debug stuff. Error, creating entry. And then we can get rid of this old window.location that was left. We'll delete that. So basically, we replaced our simple console.log with like all of this code, which builds up a JavaScript object with the data, does the fetch command passing along the data, checks the response, and then sends us back to the home page as needed. So this is how we write client-side JavaScript to communicate to our web server. The next step is we need to actually update our router to expect a post command on create entry. So if we look at router.js, we already have router.get/create entry. This responds to an HTTP GET command. We need to add a new one here, which is route.post create entry. So when we do the GET function versus the post function is how we specify different functions to be executed based on the type of command from the client. So the endpoint is the same. It's create entry in both cases, but this gets the HTML for that endpoint, and this posts the data from the user. That's the difference. So what should we do here? Let's create a local variable called entry, because I want to show you stuff in the debugger. So the entry object will be the body of the post command. We're going to log it. So that we'll deal with database stuff later, small steps. And then we need to send the success back to the client. So we'll do response dot status. We're going to send a 201 status back. So that's our way of saying this was successful, or accept, I think. We're accepting the data from the client. That's all it takes to add a route to respond to a post command. We'll come back here later and actually get rid of this and write to the database instead. But for now, this is great. So let's try it out. Let's see if it actually works. Server's still running. I don't need to restart anything or stop anything because NodeMon takes care of that for me. So I'm going to just switch back to the client and refresh my page. Clear this out so I don't get confused. Hit create entry now. Great. Choose a date. I'm still persisting. I'm still tired. I hit submit. And what do we get? Nothing prints here, which is expected, right? We got rid of the console.log on the client side. But if I switch back to VS Code, I should see the stuff logged in the debug console here. And I don't. Okay. I just see that it's just logging undefined. I probably should have followed GitHub Copilot's advice and done this so it's a little more clear. But it's just sending undefined here, like we don't actually have the entry object. Unlike earlier today with the bug I had, this one is intentional because this is one of the most common things I see students run into when they're developing a new web application is they run into this issue. And I think it's really hard to debug because it looks like we did everything right, and yet the data isn't getting to our web server. And I know the first time I ran into this, I just like was banging my head against the computer trying to figure this out. And the fix is really subtle, and it deals with Express. So here's the fix. Let's go to server.js. We need to specify additional middleware to say that we want our Express web server to be able to handle JSON content. By default, it does not, okay? So we're going to add this here after we've created our app object. I'm going to say add middleware to handle JSON in HTTP request bodies. And this is used with post commands. App.use express.json. So easy to forget this line of code. Now, the good news is, like looking ahead to the summative lab, we just added this one line of code. So you won't run into this issue with the summative lab, but it's very likely you will run into this issue if you're working on a new project next semester, or if you're doing anything else like from scratch with like Express and Node. So this is the key line we need. Now, if we go back here and go to create entry and choose a date and choose a habit of mind and submit it and go back and look, now we actually see, hey, we actually did get an object. I want to look at that more closely. So I'm going to actually go to router.js and set a breakpoint here on line 25. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, but I just want to show you what it looks like in the debugger. Because a lot of times when we're writing the server-side code, it's hard to know exactly what to expect. But what's nice here is I can look at this variable entry in my debugger, and I can actually see, oh, the content, here's like the string I typed, cool. Here's the date I selected and how it's formatted. That's useful to know. It's a string, which is interesting, right? Sometimes when we send data from the client web browser to our server, it's not always clear until we get more experience. What data type is it going to be? Is it going to be some sort of a data object? Is it going to be a string? It's going to be a string. But maybe we were expecting a data object. So it's helpful to look in the debugger and actually see how our data is formatted and what types they are. And here's the habit I selected. So this looks really good. It looks nice that we've got all this data here, which is great. So we'll continue running that.